In the Days of These Kings, the Book of Daniel in Preterist Perspective by J. Rogers. Audiobook Part 39. Part 2, Notes on Daniel. Daniel 9. Why 7 weeks prior to the 62 weeks? Daniel 9. Why 7 weeks prior to the 62 weeks? This leaves the question of how to understand the punctuation of the weeks in Daniel 9:25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again and the wall, even in troublesome times. NASB. Why is there first a period of 7 weeks? Does the punctuation of 7 weeks and 62 weeks indicate a break in time? The simplest explanation is that this is a way of expressing number sets. The Hebrew rendering of this 483-year period is literally week 7 and weeks 60 and 2. When I originally wrote my commentary on Daniel 9, I assumed that 7 weeks and 62 weeks was simply a Hebrew idiom, that is, the ancients did not always number according to the decimal system, but also focused around sets of 2, 3, 7, 12, 40, 50, and multiples thereof. I am still convinced that this is the main reason for dividing up the number of weeks into two subsets. 7 weeks and 62 weeks is simply an idiomatic way of expressing 483 years, appealing to the Hebrew numerical sets of 7 weeks plus 60 weeks plus 2 weeks. This 483-year period was a continuous time with no remarkable event dividing the first 49 years, 7 weeks, from the second 434 years, 62 weeks. I have read all sorts of explanations offered for the first 7 weeks. In my view, none are satisfactory, except as a way of generally pointing to the troublesome times that would occur after the decree of Artaxerxes in 457 BC. Some commentators portray a significance in the first 7 weeks, or 49 years, in which there were troublesome times. Daniel 9:25. These troublesome times were either in rebuilding the temple after Cyrus' decree in 537 BC, or in completing the temple and repairing the city streets and walls of Jerusalem after Artaxerxes' decree in 457 BC. The street shall be built again and the wall, even in troublesome times. Daniel 9:25. The text refers specifically to the walls. Therefore, the 7 weeks began in the time of Artaxerxes in 457 BC and extended through the troublesome times encountered by Nehemiah. Then, in 444 BC, the builders had to contend with hostility toward their efforts from other nations inhabiting the land of Judah. Of course, there were more troublesome times in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC. To that, we could add the desecration of the temple by Pompey's men in 63 BC. See Part 3, Historical Background and Resources, Ezra, for an explanation as to why Artaxerxes' decree of 457 BC implied rebuilding the streets and the walls, although there is no explicit mention of this until the time of Nehemiah in 444 BC. Another explanation notes that 7 weeks immediately precedes the 62 weeks, but also sees 70 years of desolations and the 70 weeks of years as joined together continuously. In this view, the 70 weeks of years began immediately after the end of the 70 years of desolations. This occurred with the decree of Cyrus, which was prophesied by Isaiah, who says of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, You shall be built, and to the temple your foundation shall be laid." Isaiah 44:28. John Calvin was of this opinion. I stated that we must begin with the monarchy of Cyrus. This is clearly to be gathered from the words of the angel, and especially from the division of weeks. It is quite certain that these 70 years and 70 weeks ought to be joined together. Emphasis mine. Since, therefore, these periods are continuous, whoever refers to this passage to the time of Darius Hystaspes first of all breaks the links of a chain of events all connected together, and then perverts the whole spirit of the passage. For as we yesterday stated, the angel's object was to offer consolation in the midst of sorrow. For 70 years the people had been miserably afflicted in exile, and they seemed utterly abandoned, as if God would no longer acknowledge these children of Abraham for his people and inheritance. As this was the Almighty's intention, it is quite clear that the commencement of the 70 weeks cannot be otherwise interpreted by referring it to the monarchy of Cyrus. Calvin, Commentary on Daniel 9:25. Calvin's explanation sets the beginning of the 490-year timeline too early, since Cyrus gave his decree in 537 BC. Nevertheless, if we begin with Artaxerxes' decree in Ezra's time, beginning in 457 BC, then 7 weeks, or 49 years, extended through the time of Nehemiah, which included the rebuilding of the wall of the city in troublesome times. Daniel 9:25. This could be the fulfillment of the 49 years. The specific reference to the street and the wall addresses our attention to Nehemiah's situation, when the streets were covered with debris and the walls needed to be rebuilt. Troublesome times are described in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi, which cover the historical period from 457 onward. If we extend this period all the way to 408 BC, this is 49 years. The problem with this view is that nothing is known to be significant about the year 408 BC. Another explanation notices that 49 years is a jubilee period. 49 years is 1/10 of 490 years, just as a week of years is 1/10 of 70 years. The Jews were obliged to tithe their increase in their time. The Sabbath is a time of rest given as an offering to God, or 1/7 of our time. The Jews were also commanded to observe a Sabbath year every 7th year and a Jubilee year every 49th year. It can be demonstrated that the 70-year captivity was a punishment for disobeying the Sabbath year law. The angel is setting out to Daniel a period when the streets and the wall would be rebuilt, even in troublesome times, to be a period of 7 sevens, or a Jubilee period of 49 years. After this time, the land would enter a time of rest in the 50th year, according to the law of Moses. So even though no significant event attends the 50th year, the Jews are being reminded to observe the Sabbath year and the Jubilee year, since failure to observe the Sabbath laws is what brought the judgment of God in the first place. The Lord then spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its crop. But during the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall sound a horn all through your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you." Leviticus 25, 1-4, 8-10, NASB. According to this interpretation, the 7 weeks of years are 7 Sabbaths of years, or a jubilee period. The last jubilee mentioned in Scripture was the 25th year of Ezekiel's captivity in 574 BC, Ezekiel 41. All the jubilee cycles of Scripture can be discovered by going back in 49-year intervals from that date. The first Jubilee year began on the date that Joshua and the people of Israel entered the land of Canaan in 1406 BC. Daniel 9 seems to be marking off a new Jubilee period at the beginning of the 70 weeks. This explanation fits with the setting of the beginning of the 490 years in 457 BC and ending in AD 34, the cutting off of the Messiah occurring in the middle of the 70th week in AD 30. This explains why 49 years might be set apart from the 434 years without requiring any significant historical event to account for the punctuation. See the section Part 3, Historical Background and Resources, Jeremiah, for a full explanation of the 70-year captivity as God's punishment for disobeying the Sabbath law.